challenging.
Large global problems. There's a climate problem.
Climate change is happening.
Agriculture and livestock farming date back to the very start of Irish civilization. It has been a part of Ireland and its economy for centuries, and more than 150,000 families are directly dependent on the farms. The practice of farming is significantly based on the weather and climate movements.
Farming in Ireland is made up of many different aspects. Dairy and tillage, sheep and beef production. We are good at growing this thing you see underneath me, grass.
It works extremely well from the perspective of a low-cost, highly productive system of agriculture that is environmentally friendly in terms of having the animals out on the land throughout the year.
Well, farming is very much dependent on the climate, and it depends on the kind of, farming or the sector that you're in. And I suppose the biggest ones that would depend on it would be, we'll say, tillage and maybe horticulture. They're a lot dependent on the weather.
Ireland has a huge advantage from its weather for cereal production, but particularly for grass production. For the dairy industry in particular, like cows can graze probably 10 months of the year on grass, 9 to 10 months a year, and that's a huge advantage over other parts of the world.
The farmer is very dependent on the climate and on weather conditions to make his or her income, and it's absolutely imperative that we protect our climate into the future. Nobody has a greater stake.
Climate change has become the biggest challenge for the world, and various actions are needed to reduce or control its effects. One of those actions is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from different sectors. Agriculture is also a large contributor to these emissions, and scientists have made it clear that it is impossible to achieve the targets of emission reductions without making specific changes in the sector. At the same time, agriculture is highly affected by climate change itself, and the farmers are facing various problems due to it.
Well, I suppose one of the biggest difficulties would be that, if the weather is not good, if there's a lot of rain, a lot of cold, the grass doesn't grow, it's slower to grow. Therefore, you have to have shed space to be able to keep the stock indoors.
It's hard to believe in a country that's so wet that we suffer from what we call an Irish drought, which wouldn't be a drought in any other part of the world, but it is starting to affect some crops, particularly spring barley, which is a big traditional crop in Ireland for cattle feed.
In some low-lying areas, we'll say the worst effects will be if the sea level rises too much. You will get areas of we'll say around the coast and places where we'll say maybe at sea level or maybe slightly under it. They can work at the moment, they can get away with it, but as that changes, those areas will become unfarmable. They won't be suitable for agricultural production, and that could be a big issue for us in the future as well.
The climate changes, we could see 25 or 30% of our farmers have to exit the industry because it wouldn't be economically viable for them to stay farming commercially. We need to be very cautious about what we do and how we do it. We equally need to be cautious about how we protect our environment. But I suppose the difficulty for us is that we're very dependent on our agriculture in Ireland, and that dependence is highlighted in the percentage of emissions from agriculture. We don't have other hardline industries out there in our communities, let alone our rural economies.
Ireland's agriculture industry accounts for 37% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of the country. The government's Climate Action Plan 2021 had set a target of 25% emission reduction by 2030 for the sector. To achieve this target, farmers have to make various changes in their farming practices or reduce the number of cattle in the herds.
Sure, I suppose in conjunction we say with our agricultural advisors, there's a whole raft of measures in the line of to try and mitigate the amount of carbon dioxide and methane going up into the atmosphere. I mean, we have we're trying to use less fertilizer, and that's coming in enshrined in legislation in the next year or so. We can't let the slurry that we sprayed on the land go up into the atmosphere, so we've had to change our practice in order to reduce the carbon dioxide and the methane out of that product. So, and we've also had to change our feeding regime and how we feed and what we feed the animals. So, yeah, those things are impinging on our system, but it's an expense. It's an extra expense, and that will mean that we won't be able to make the living or the income that we were making.
Teagasc, the state body, has devised this MAC curve, marginal abatement cost curve, which shows how mechanisms and how measures on farms can be put in place which would help reduce our climate's emissions by maybe about 18%, between 14 to around 18%. And what that will look like is mass adaptation of different grass species that we're going to be growing. You hear multi-species swards, you hear clovers being incorporated. So all of these will be incorporated in order to use less fertiliser, having the needs to have less fertiliser.
And multi-species swards have a mixture of grasses, herb plants and legumes, both red and white clover. And these have the capacity to work together. The longer rooting systems help in drought scenarios. The clover helps to fix nitrogen. So what you're getting is equivalent production to a high nitrogen input perennial ryegrass system. Well, farmers are cautious by nature. But we're getting uptake of, I suppose, a number of the technologies. If you look at two of the key ones that currently can reduce emissions both of ammonia and greenhouse gases is the use of protected urea and low emission slurry spreading. Now, there was questions that needed to be asked about protected urea, and I think those have comprehensively been answered in terms of any ill effects in terms of food residues, etc. So those questions have been answered, and farmers are now beginning to take them up in a big way, and those can have a massive impact. Low emission slurry spreading has been another technology that farmers have adopted. It's an expensive technology, but government have helped through a grant system. So that is being taken by a very significant number of farmers. So where technologies are proven to work and where they're not extremely expensive, farmers will take them up. So that's a change that's beginning to happen in the industry, and it's picking up pace rapidly.
The new climate action plan is being compared with the older plans of the government to increase production on farms. Also, it's a matter of concern that the new plans might force the farmers out of business.
The last 10, 15, 20 years in agriculture, it has been like drive on, increase, improvements, push up the numbers, push up the stock. We had Harvest 2020, we had Foodwise, we had different names on different programmes, and all of the government policy and the Teagasc policy was to increase numbers, increase stock, increase agriculture. If the previous model was that you needed to increase numbers to get the income to make money on the farm, to be able to pay your bills, make your repayments to the banks, how are you going to be able to make that same money now from less animals? And there doesn't seem to be an increase in the price of the product that you're selling to cope with the difference in margin. So that is a big question.
It's not the huge farm family that it's going to affect. It's going to affect the very modest farm families that are farming intensively in order to be economically viable. We don't have our heads in the sand. Change has to happen, but change has to be economically feasible and economically viable.
Farmers are very willing to do their part when it comes to biodiversity and sustainable farming. Absolutely. And the investment that some farmers have made, both on the tillage and particularly in dairy, beef and sheep farms, has been significant. And farmers are not afraid of that. But what they are afraid of is being put out of business by policy.
Farmers also claim that they are not getting satisfactory help from the government and are disappointed with the way they are being blamed for the emissions.
Well, there's plenty of legislation from the government anyway, which I don't know is very helpful at times. I suppose, they want to reduce the output by what they're doing. In a way, they want to reduce whether we like it or not, and we don't like it. But we would feel that we are being made kind of the scapegoat of that challenge.
Very little help, I'm afraid. It's a case of you should do this and you should do that. Very, very little help. Find it hugely frustrating that there isn't an agri-environmental scheme there that would be attractive to the dairy farmer or indeed to the intensive beef producer.
I think we need to be considered as the solution providers going forward and not public enemy number one.
And everybody needs to play their part. It's not just any one particular sector. And agriculture feels like it's picked on at the moment.
I'm not a demon, I'm not a monster, and I'm willing to change and learn, but don't beat me with a stick to do so.